How's everybody doing? This is Mr. Kunkel again. Today we're going to talk about negative exponents. We're going to talk about whenever our exponent is negative. We talked about negative bases in a video, but this video we're going to talk about when the exponent itself is negative. So let's look back. Let's remember 2 to the 2 power. And let's look at this in the terms that we did whenever we talked about 0 power. Remember when we talked about the 0 power, we said 1, like we would talk about here, it'd be 1 times 2, 2 times. So that's 1 times 2 times 2 would be 4. So let's talk about negative exponent. Let's talk about 2 to the negative 2. In math, we generally say if something's negative, generally we say it's the opposite. So here we have positive 2, we multiply. Whenever we have negative 2, we're going to think of it as divide. And we know that if we're dividing by 2, that's the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So let's think about it in those terms. So we're going to say 1 times, so since it's 2 to the negative 2, we're going to divide by 2 twice. Or we're just going to say we're going to multiply by 1/2 twice. That's times 1/2 times 1/2. So that's equal to 1 times 1/2 is 1/2. 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4. So if we take 2 raised to the negative 2 power, we get 1/4. If we look here, we should see there's a similarity between these two. 2 to the 2 gave us 4. 2 to the negative 2 gave us 1/4. There's a shortcut we can do here. Whenever we have a negative exponent, basically since we're going to be dividing, we can flip it. So if we have 2 to the negative 2, what we're going to do is we're going to flip this. We're going to make it into its reciprocal and change its sign. What we're thinking of is we want to work with, in general, we want to work with exponents that are positive. So if we have 2 to the negative 2, we can flip this and make it 1 over 2 squared. We know 2 squared is 4, so we could simplify this to 1 over 4. And you'll see we get the same answers. Let's look at another example. 3 to the negative 3. Now we could write that. We could do 1 times 1/3 3 times, since this is telling us we're dividing or multiplying by the fraction 1/3. Or we can use this little shortcut we found here and do 1 over 3 to the 3rd. 3 to the 3rd we know as 3 times 3 times 3, which we should know as 1 over 27. So whenever we have a negative exponent, we're going to flip it. Let's take a look at, let's say we have 1 over 2 to the negative 3. So this is saying in the denominator 2 is going to be, or 1 is going to be multiplied by 1/2 3 times. Since it's negative, we're multiplying by the fraction. But we're just going to simplify this. This is a negative exponent, so it comes up to the top. So this we could just write as 2 to the 3rd. And we could say over 1, which is 2 to the 3rd, which we should know as 8. So let's look at a few more examples. Remember, all we're doing with negative exponents is if it's in the bottom and it has a negative exponent, it goes to the top. If it's in the top and it's a negative exponent, it goes down to the bottom. So we're going to look at 3 cases. We're going to look at, let's say, 3 to the negative 2 over 4. We're going to look at 3 over 4 to the negative 2. And then we're going to look at parentheses 3 over 4 to the negative 2. And we're going to look at how placing this negative affects it. So an important thing to remember, whenever this 4 is down here by itself, it doesn't have an exponent. But if it doesn't have an exponent, we can think of it as being raised to the first power. And same thing with this 3 here, we can think of it as being raised to that first power. So remember, if it has a positive exponent, it's not going to move. If it has a negative exponent, it's going to move. So here, this 3 to the negative 2, we want to make that negative 2 positive. So that means that 3 is coming down here. Whenever that 3 comes down here, it just leaves a 1 on top. We're left with 1 over 4 times 3 squared. Here we can say 1 over 4, 3 squared is 9. And we can just say that is 1 over 36. So what happens here whenever we have 3 to the first power, since it wasn't being raised to a power, so we assume it's to the first power, over 4 to the negative 2. Well, in this case, we have a negative exponent down here, so we want to move that exponent up top. So to do that, or we want to make it positive, I'm sorry, I misphrased that. We want to make that negative positive. To do that, we're going to move it on top. So whenever we move it on top, the 3 stays on top because it has a positive exponent. Because we're assuming it's being raised to positive 1 since it didn't have an exponent listed. And so this 4 to the negative 2, we can move up and then we can make that 4 to the positive 2. And since nothing left on bottom, we just say there's a 1 down there. So then this becomes 3 times 16. And since we're over 1, we can just get rid of that 1. Just ignore it. And then 3 times 16. 3 times 6 is 8. Here, 1. That should be 48. So you see, making sure we understand that negative 2 goes to that 3, that negative 2 goes to that 4. So what happens here whenever we have 3 over 4 to the negative 2? Well, there's parentheses there. So we know both 3 and the 4 are being raised to the negative 2. So we could write that as 3 to the negative 2 over 4 to the negative 2. Now, how are we going to make those exponents positive? Well, remember, we're going to say that 3 is going to go down and that 4 is going to come up. Negative exponent always moves. So that leaves us with 4 squared over 3 squared, which is 16 over 9. And so we could have skipped this step because we know 3 over 4, what happened? They ended up flipping. So here you could have just said 4 over 3 to the 2, which would have led us here. So remember that negative exponent just makes it flip. So that covers it for negative exponents today. As I said, just remember, if it's a negative, if you have a negative exponent, if it's on top, it needs to go to the bottom. If it's a negative exponent on bottom, it needs to go to the top. And that's really it for negative exponents.